Good evening and welcome to Rice University. We want to thank all of you for joining us for this special evening. As part of the goals that we have set forth as part of our strategic plan at Rice as we approach our 100th anniversary, we've included greater international engagement and greater service to the world outside, whether here in Houston or around the world. We hope that our students will, in that context, have the opportunity to apply some of what they have learned at Rice to solve problems in real-world settings with people who have needs. The Beyond Traditional Borders and Rice 360 programs are helping Rice meet these goals. In Beyond Traditional Borders, students design technological and educational solutions to real challenges doctors and teachers face in the developing world. Through internships around the world, students then put their designs into practice along with doctors and teachers. Rice 360 builds on this program. Rice 360 is a university-wide initiative announced last year under the leadership of Professor Rebecca Richards-Cordum to bring together undergraduates and graduate students, faculty members and scholars, clinicians and community members to create and implement affordable, effective, and sustainable solutions to the health problems of the world's poorest people. These programs reflect our confidence that even as a small university, we can make a great difference. When earlier this year we assigned 3 cups of tea as our common reading and invited Greg Mortensen to our campus to speak, we hope the message that our students received was that everyone can indeed make a difference. In that spirit, it's a great honor and pleasure to host Stephen Lewis tonight. His book, Race Against Time, a collection of talks he delivered for Canada's Massey Lecture Series, was described by one reviewer as both devastating and uplifting. If you care about the world's poor and what the wealthy world is doing, or more accurately, perhaps not doing, to address their problems, you need to read his book and we need to hear from him. In many ways, the foundational question here is what are the obligations we owe to other human beings who are suffering beyond our borders and out of our sight? Are we all part of one humanity that needs to think much more than we do as having obligations that extend beyond borders to all of those around our world? We're pleased to have, in addition to Stephen Lewis, a cultural opportunity to help capture that spirit tonight. We'll begin this evening with a performance by the Houston chapter of the United Nations Association International Choir. This is an international choir which always performs songs in the languages in which they were originally written. The choir is directed by Dr. Philip Kluckner, who teaches here at the Shepherd School of Music. Please join me in welcoming the United Nations Association International Choir.
so chilly and cold. It chills the body, not the soul. When Satan tempts me, it's all in vain. With my Lord Jesus I remain. Oh, every time I feel the Spirit moving in my heart, I will pray. Oh, every time I feel the Spirit moving in my heart, I will pray. Oh, every time I feel the Spirit moving in my heart, I will pray. Oh, every time I feel the Spirit moving in my heart, I will pray, will pray. Oh, when I feel, oh, when I feel, oh, when I feel, oh, when I feel, yes, when I feel the Spirit moving, I pray. Oh, when I feel the Spirit moving, I will pray. Oh, when I feel the Spirit moving,
Thank you so much for that wonderful performance tonight. On behalf of Rice 360, I'd like to thank all of you for joining us tonight for this very special program. I have a number of people I need to thank. First of all, President Lebron and Ambassador Dirigian for helping to make the program possible, as well as our partners at the Baker Institute, the Jones School, the School of Humanities, and the Beyond Traditional Borders program. As part of our new minor in global health technologies, Rice undergraduates have worked to design and teach new classes on waterborne diseases and their prevention for primary school students in Haiti. They've taught entrepreneurship courses for secondary school students in Lesotho. Working with colleagues in the Baker Institute, they've carried out a community assessment of energy and water needs in Lesotho. And they've designed and built a diagnostic lab in a backpack to help physicians provide care in remote areas. The students' work tonight is displayed around the auditorium, and I invite you to stay after the lecture for a special reception to talk with them about their experiences. I think that you'll find that through these experiences, they've really been transformed. The experiences wouldn't be possible without our partners at the Baker Institute and the Baylor International Pediatric AIDS Initiative and other clinics and schools around the world, and we're very grateful for their partnership and their support. Our speaker this evening is Stephen Lewis. Mr. Lewis has spent his life advocating for those who often go overlooked and unheard in Africa. His self-described love affair with Africa has burgeoned into a lifelong commitment to speaking out on its behalf for those who struggle against the challenges of poverty, of poor health, and of lack of educational opportunity. Mr. Lewis spent more than 20 years in senior positions with the United Nations. He served as the Canadian ambassador, the deputy executive director of UNICEF, and the Secretary General's special envoy for HIV/AIDS in Africa. Since his tenure there ended, he has established the AIDS-Free World, an international advocacy organization that works for more urgent, just, and compassionate responses to AIDS. Among Mr. Lewis's many honors are his appointment to the Companion Order of Canada. In April of 2005, Mr. Lewis was named by Time magazine as one of the world's most influential people. Throughout his career, Mr. Lewis has shown an unwavering loyalty to the people of Africa who shoulder the cruelest burden of HIV/AIDS. He has lobbied for greater financial resources to build the workforce of teachers and healthcare workers, advocated for an end to school fees, and promoted universal HIV/AIDS treatment. He has visited villages and communities across the continent to learn more about the virus from the people who live with its devastating effects. For Mr. Lewis, the pandemic is not just a collection of numbers and statistics, but rather it's an assembly of individual lives, of grandmothers, of orphans, of women and men who live with the disease and its accompanying challenges. As long as Mr. Lewis continues his work, the world will know what AIDS looks like. It's a great honor to host him here tonight at Rice University. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Stephen Lewis.
I'm thoroughly tickled to be here and to participate, as it were, as an extension of Rice 360 and beyond traditional borders. I feel there's a great deal I would like to disgorge, and therefore I'm going to speak with an almost supernatural rapidity and beg you to bear with me in the process. I have enormous respect for the content of Beyond Traditional Borders and Rice 360, and I'm going to, in perhaps a fashion faintly unorthodox, attempt to reconnoiter subject matters slightly beyond the traditional and create a context which I hope makes some sense for the work that everyone is doing, particularly in relation to the continent of Africa, but most emphatically in relation to the use of technology at local level and the emphasis on health and education, which suffuses all of your work. I was inclined in speeches latterly to draw the juxtaposition between the $3 billion a week which the United States is spending on the war in Iraq and the tremendous difficulty it is for the world to raise $10 billion in 1 year to address a pandemic which has taken more than 25 million lives and has 33 million people in its grip, and the loss of the moral anchor of the world, which those comparisons suggest, has always seemed to me to be emblematic of a decline in ethical standards around what is important in terms of the human condition and human priorities. And then today, I picked up a news report on my computer screen early this morning, which indicated that in a shared panel at the Clinton Global Initiative, which is now taking place in New York, Bono had indicated how profoundly unlovely it is that we cannot seem to find $25 billion a year to address the needs of over 9 million children under the age of 5 who die every year from preventable diseases, but we are able, in the blink of an eye, to summon $700 billion to bail out the speculative financiers of Wall Street. And Bono was again suggesting that the juxtaposition of these two realms conjures up a sense of lack of priority, a sense of immorality in terms of the human condition, which is profoundly repugnant. I emphasize that because the basic reason for Clinton and Bono to be addressing a subject like that today, flowing as it did from the Clinton Global Initiative, is because on this very day, today, Thursday, September 25th, the United Nations is meeting to assess the Millennium Development Goals. And this morning, the Secretary General of the United Nations addressed the General Assembly, and he was followed by a number of others, of heads of state and heads of government, to take a look at the 8 Millennium Development Goals and how far we have or have not come. And the day today and the day tomorrow will be devoted to those goals, and those goals, in a sense, speak to everything that this university is about in its grasp of internationalism. I want to remind you that in the 1990s, there was an assumption that the world would embrace globalization, and that globalization would, by virtue of cultural harmony and international technology and a much greater reverence for social justice and equality, usher us into another century which was rather more friendly to the human predicament. But as we moved through the last decade of the 20th century, it became more and more evident that globalization was lacking in some terribly important respects. It couldn't deal with poverty, couldn't deal with disease, couldn't deal with conflict, couldn't deal with the environment. And so the entire world got together in the Millennium General Assembly of the year 2000 and decided to set a series of targets which the world called the Millennium Development Goals, and which, were they to be achieved, would overcome the tremendous disparity between the uprooted and disinherited on one hand and the immensely wealthy and privileged on the other. And the reason that the General Assembly of the United Nations is meeting today and tomorrow is because they wanted to assess the progress or lack of progress on the goals at the halfway mark. And the reality is that in many parts of the world, the goals will be achieved only in part. South Asia, Southeast Asia, Latin America. On the continent of Africa, not a single country in sub-Saharan Africa will achieve all of the goals. And almost all of the countries of sub-Saharan Africa will achieve none of the goals. And that says something about the nature of international society. So I wanted to remind you, if I could, of the goals that were established by consensus. There was not a single dissenting voice. No one held a gun to the head of any nation state. They all embraced the Millennium Development Goals, and remind you of the goals and make some comments on them as I reconnoiter their substance. The first, and I'll take them in an order which gratifies me, but may not be absolutely methodical as they were set out. The first goal was, of course, to cut the most egregious forms of poverty and hunger in half by the year 2015, which is the target date for all the goals. And we're not succeeding. As a matter of fact, poverty is becoming more and more viscerally entrenched within countries and between and among countries. Until about 3 weeks ago, the World Bank, in its studies of international poverty, said that the cutoff line for the worst forms of poverty was people living under $1 a day, and they estimated that there were 930 million people in that predicament. Then they did a reassessment, and they issued the results of their reassessment 2 to 3 weeks ago and said that the poverty line should be $1.25 a day, not $1 a day, and based on that calculus, there were 1.4 billion people below the poverty line. And in fact, said the World Bank, another 100 million had been added in the last 3 or 4 months as a result of the excruciating rise in food prices. That's more than a quarter of the world's population living on less than $1.25 a day. There's something profoundly ugly, unbearable about that. I can't tell you how many rooms I have sat in with 40 or 50 or 60, usually women, living with the virus, the AIDS virus. And after baring their souls and speaking feelingly of what they were struggling with, I would say to them, "What can I do for you? How can I help?" Always expecting them to say, "We need drugs." They never say, "We need drugs." They always say, "We need food." Everyone is hungry. I sometimes feel so frantic because I don't know how to convey the depths of the hunger in so many of the countries where the prevalence rates are so high in southern and eastern Africa. But the truth of the matter is that if a child is not in school, that child may not even get one meal a day at lunchtime. And so many of the grandmothers who look after the children never eat on the weekends. And this tremendous need for food, which is so urgent and yet so difficult because the major Western powers are not now providing the funds sufficient for the World Food Program to deliver on its mandate. I read again just this morning that the World Food Program is suspending almost all of its shipments into Uganda because they simply cannot find sufficient resources to purchase the food at the present prices that would make it possible to feed the hungry. And this matter of hunger and poverty, which are so inextricably bound together, is of course lacerating the developing world. And the second Millennium Development Goal was, as Bono indicated, dramatically to reduce the infant mortality rate. And may I make the point that these kids who are dying at a rate of 25 to 27,000 a day under the age of 5, they're not dying of exotic diseases. They're dying of acute respiratory infections like pneumonia. They're dying of malnutrition, diarrhea, dehydration. It's an extraordinary phenomenon that we're in the early part of the 21st century, and we are losing between 9 and 10 children every year of preventable diseases. There is no blessed reason under the sun why we could not adequately respond. But for whatever complex of explanations, the rich world, the G8 world, is unable to energize itself to make an adequate response. I've never understood that. I was participating in a forum sponsored by Doctors Without Borders, Médecins Sans Frontières, last week or two in New York, where they were making the point that there is ready-to-use nutritional food supplements for children between the ages of 6 months after they have finished exclusive breastfeeding and 2 years. So many of these children die of extreme and acute malnutrition, particularly in emergency situations, and there is ready-to-use therapeutic food, they call it RUTF, and yet it's not available for distribution. And the costs are negligible. And I sit and listen in a symposium like that, participate in a symposium like that, and I am never able to comprehend what in God's name is it about this world that we can't get our priorities right. And the third Millennium Development Goal is to profoundly reduce maternal mortality rates. It's not as widely recognized as it should be that over 500,000 women die in childbirth every year. We've never been able to reduce the numbers. We've never been able to reduce the carnage. We know everything there is to know about emergency obstetric intervention. We know about midwives. We know about birth attendants. We know about moving women who are having difficulty in labor from the rural hinterland into urban hospitals. And for some reason, for 20 or 25 years, like some demonic, repetitive pattern, we've never been able to reduce the numbers. You know, if people dealing with beyond traditional borders and Rice 360 are thinking of the technical and technological interventions that might facilitate a better health intervention, using all of the scientific capacity that we have, this would make an astonishing contribution if some of it could be devoted around infant mortality and child mortality with the present healthcare workers who are on the scene, but somehow limited in their scope of healing. And the fourth Millennium Development Goal is to put every single child into primary school who's of primary school age. And believe it or not, we've got 75 to 100 million children of primary school age who are not in school. The overwhelming majority of them are girls. Girls are always discriminated against. Girls always carry the blight of discrimination. They're often taken out of school to look after sick and dying or ailing parents. And they can't get to school largely because they can't pay the school fees, or they can't pay for the uniforms, or the textbooks, or the parent-teacher association fees, or the examination fees. And yet, when the fees are lifted, The race for school, the yearning for school, it's almost Pavlovian. It's just overwhelming. In Kenya, in the elections, I guess it was in December of 2003, when the old Moi regime was defeated and President Kibaki came into power, and he had made only one promise in that election campaign. He would remove school fees. And unlike a number of pre-Paleolithic politicians I know, he actually did remove the school fees, and within a matter of 6 weeks, 1,300,000 children turned up at the doors of the Kenyan schools who had never been in school before. Now, admittedly, there was some problem of overcrowding here and there was the necessity of a great deal of instantaneous teacher training, but it just showed what a tremendous wish there was on the part of the kids to go to school, and how difficult it was to get there while the school fees precluded them. Can I be allowed one ideological spasm? I'm by and large under control. You may not think so, but I'm exerting almost cosmic self-discipline. I'm a democratic socialist. I don't want to induce a cardiac arrest in anyone in the audience. And in my country, that's so mainstream, it's incomparably boring. In the United States, I'd be in Guantanamo. But I do want to suggest to you that I perfectly and readily admit I'm on the Democratic left. And one of the things which drives me crazy is the reality that there never used to be school fees, which were making it impossible for young kids to go to school. This was a product of what we call structural adjustment programs, the most idiotic and perverse econometric designs imposed on developing countries, primarily in Africa, by the World Bank and by the International Monetary Fund in the 80s and in the 90s, where they offered money, usually to corrupt dictatorships, offered money to countries and said, you can have the money, but we're imposing conditions, and the conditions are called user fees. And suddenly countries which had never paid before for hospital access were paying fees, and countries which had never paid before for education or schools were paying school fees. And of course, 10 years later, the World Bank said we were wrong. It was a terrible mistake. We should have listened to the critics at the time. And that's the pattern of the World Bank. Every 10 years, there's a new set of nostrums imposed, and 10 years later, everyone is apologetic because of the damage they've done. But those school fees did tremendous damage in the educational system, as the fees in health did tremendous damage to the healthcare system. And of course, the consequences linger on. That's the way these things work, and unto this day, they continue to linger on. And the fifth Millennium Development Goal, and I will admit to you, the one I feel far and away the most strongly about, is the quest for some kind of gender equality. I live in a feminist family. I love it. All our kids are feminist. They know that if they're not feminist, they're disinherited. This is not a negotiable item in our family. But I've always believed, and I believe more and more now, that the power of the feminist analysis, particularly in the analysis of the exercise of male power and hegemony, is almost irresistible in its analytic force. And the situation of gender inequality around the world is so heartbreaking that it's almost beyond the capacity of the mind to comprehend. Whether it's international sexual trafficking, or whether it's female genital mutilation, or whether it's child brides, or whether it's honor killings. Did you read a few weeks ago of that incredible situation in Baluchistan, the northern province of Pakistan, where 5 young women were stabbed virtually to death and then buried alive because they had the presumption, the audacity to want to choose their own partners? There's a degree of grotesquerie in all of that, which is insufferable and unnerving in the extreme. or whether it's the absence of property rights or inheritance rights or economic autonomy or political representation or the absence of laws against rape and sexual violence, the toll it takes on the women of the world is indescribable. And there's not a single society in this world, including Canada, the United States, Norway, Denmark, Sweden, Holland, you name all the progressive countries you want, that begin to approximate gender equality in so many avenues, including simple pay, where in my country, for example, in Canada, women in equivalent occupational gradations earn 75 to 77 cents on the male dollar, and they have the same experience and the same tenure and the same knowledge as any of the men who occupy those posts. But it's so much more extreme when things are analyzed. The World Health Organization recently did a stunning report interviewing 25,000 women in 14 countries on questions of physical and sexual violence, and found that the lowest levels of physical and sexual violence were 14% in Japan. The highest level was 71% in rural Ethiopia. And when they looked at comparable studies in Canada, the United States, and the United Kingdom, they found ranges of 30 to 35%. This is largely intimate partner violence. This is profound domestic violence, but it's deeply rooted in all our societies. And when societies are under siege, when societies are in a state of destabilization for whatever reason, then the predatory male sexual behavior, the acting out that occurs, seems to know virtually no limits. You get a country like South Africa, which has the highest absolute number of infections, of AIDS infections in the world, 5,700,000 people living with the virus, between 800 and 1,000 deaths from AIDS-related illnesses every day. And last year there were 52,000 reported rapes. And everybody knows that the reported rapes are only 5 to 10% of the actual number. I have to say that I shed no tears for the removal of President Mbeki, because his denialism around AIDS consigned a very, very large number of people to unnecessary death. As a matter of fact, when people talk about taking Thabo Mbeki before the International Criminal Court for crimes against humanity, it doesn't unsettle me for a second. And just today, literally a few hours ago, the Minister of Health was fired by the new transitional president of South Africa. And that's a godsend to get a kind of psychotic Minister of Health who didn't understand the health priorities in her own country out of office. And frankly, when you get that kind of tremendous turbulence in a country as a result of a virus, of the pandemic, you get this habit of sexual violence. And sexual violence, which is extreme, of course, transmits the virus. And in areas of conflict, if I may be permitted, I'm speaking to a university audience, I'm speaking to people who care about these issues. Let me bare my soul, because I just can't stand it. In areas of conflict, the rape and sexual violence is completely out of control. It's like some kind of international contagion which has been unleashed. We knew it with the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia. And it wasn't very long ago when the president of Indonesia apologized to East Timor for the sexual violence that had been unleashed when East Timor was seeking independence. And we certainly know it from the Balkans, where a number of the military leaders came up before the International Criminal Court for crimes against humanity, which were rooted in sexual violence. And we've seen it in Colombia. And we saw it recently in Kenya after the consternation around the contested elections, when more and more women were turning up who had been raped at the hospitals in Kenya. And I was recently in Liberia meeting with the president and the minister of gender and the UNICEF representative. They happened to be friends, and they were telling me of this phenomenon, which is truly amazing. That when the wars are over, when the terrible civil conflicts are over, the raping continues. As a matter of fact, to some extent, it is accentuated. And in Liberia, the most recent statistics that UNICEF had showed that the rapes were suffered by girls between the ages of 10 and 14. When I was in the little health center in Thika, in Kenya, not all that long ago. Many of you will know The Flame Trees of Thika, Elspeth Huxley's wonderful novel. And it was the only sort of rape crisis center in the entire catchment area for that little hospital. And I sat with the counselors to talk to them. They were telling me that there were 30 and 40 rapes every month, and the numbers were growing, that were reported, that came to the hospital setting. And then they began to cry, and they told me how they could cope with the terrible stories they heard, except for a new pattern which was emerging. And the pattern that was emerging was an increasing number of women between the ages of 65 and 80 who had been raped on the assumption by the young rapists that they would not then be subject to transmission of the virus. It's just staggering. And you've heard of what happens in Darfur, and you know what happens in northern Uganda. In Zimbabwe, the numbers of rapes that were unleashed by Mugabe as a carefully orchestrated effort to humiliate and subdue entire communities through sexual violence directed at the women. They called them terror camps. The young Mugabe Youth Corps and thugs engaged in raping. It was just astonishing. And without giving you details, which you can well understand I cannot share, just 2 weeks ago, my NGO, AIDS Free World, we took 5 lawyers to a southern African country and began to take affidavits from the women who had been raped in order to preserve the evidence, so that if one day there's a case before the International Criminal Court or a national court or a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the evidence will be there and be preserved with a commissioner of oaths and taken under legal confines and environments and absolutely be irrefutable. But the stories are horrendous. And the worst place in the world for women at the moment is in the Congo. In the last few years, you've had 250,000 of the most savage and brutal acts of sexual violence. And what is so disturbing about it, and I want to convey this as strongly as I can, is that everyone in citadels of power knows what's happening. Every member of the Security Council knows what's happening. There are 17,000 peacekeepers from the United Nations in the Congo, the biggest single peacekeeping force in the world. All of the reports come back. And it's been going on for years. It's the consequence of the Rwandan genocide and the way in which the génocidaires crossed the border from Rwanda into what was then the Congo and is now Zaire. Or was Zaire, it was then and is now the Congo. And what broke it open latterly was not a government. It was Ensler, the magnificent poet and writer and dramatist of the Vagina Monologues, who went to the Congo in August of last year and came back and wrote a remarkable piece of work, an essay, the opening words of which were, "I have just returned from hell." And I don't have the emotional equanimity to read the voices of the women that Eve conveyed. We're not talking about gang raping of 8-year-olds and 80-year-olds. We're talking about mutilation and amputation and guns and knives. Do you know there is a medical term now at the little Panzi hospital in Bukavu, in the eastern region of the Congo, a medical term called vaginal destruction? The sexual and reproductive organs of the women so damaged in the course of the frenzy of sexual violence. And these wonderful surgeons who are trying desperately, surgically to repair the women, but the damage is often beyond repair. It's fistula and beyond fistula. And Eve has appeared before the Security Council, and everyone has heard what she said. and Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International and many of the organizations have submitted absolutely unanswerable analyses of what is happening in the Congo, and it rose to such lengths that your Secretary of State, Condoleezza Rice, on June 19th last, went before the Security Council and had passed a resolution which elevated sexual violence to an act of international peace and security. It had never been seen that way before, evidence of international peace and security, if it continued. And it was focused in large measure on the Congo. So everyone knows, everyone understands, and it continues to this day. Eve Ensler is in the Congo now. My colleague in AIDS-Free World traveled with Eve at the end of last year in the Congo. We received constant reports, and despite the alleged presence of 12 United Nations agencies and 17,000 peacekeeping troops, the raping continues. I guess I wasn't sure what I wanted to say about all of this. In the middle of the 1990s, I spent 2 years of my life investigating the genocide in Rwanda. I was on a panel that had been appointed by the Organization of African Unity. It was an amazing panel. There were 7 of us, 4 Africans and 3 non-Africans. It was chaired by the former president of Botswana. My colleague panelists were Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, who is now the first woman president in Africa and Liberia, and the present president of Mali. It was a very serious panel. And for 2 years, we visited the commemorative sites and interviewed the survivors. It was emotionally, as you can imagine, pretty difficult. And at the end of the process, I remember we were in Kigali, and we were visiting something called the Polyclinique d'Espoir, the Polyclinic of Hope, where the women who had been raped during the genocide got together to network with each other and to seek solace from each other. And after the presentation from the leader of the women was over, she asked whether any of us would go into an adjacent room, because there were 3 women who wanted to talk to us especially, and 3 of us said yes. And we went into this little adjacent room. I'll never forget it. There, the sun was beating down mercilessly on a tin roof. The place was steaming hot. There were 3 steel cots in the room, and on each cot there sat a woman. And the first woman was very young. She was in her late teens or early 20s. And she had been repeatedly raped and had sharp and blunt instruments and pesticides inserted into her vagina. And she was HIV positive. And she said to us she saw no purpose in living. And indeed, 3 years later, she had died of the virus. And the second woman was tremendously feisty. She was probably in her 30s, and she said, "You're always asking me to forgive and forget. Why should I forgive and forget? I never see any remorse around me. I look out my window in the morning and I see the men who raped me walking casually to work. Why should I forgive or forget?" And the third woman, I've often wondered what happened to her. She was a woman of immense, incomparable dignity. In her 40s, I would guess. She had been tied to a bed for 3 months and used as a perpetual raping machine. And she looked at us and she said words that are seared into my mind. Whether I'm in the fields, or whether I'm at market, or whether I'm at home, I can never get the smell of semen out of my nostrils. And I drew back from that lovely, dignified woman, and I thought, has the world gone mad? It's the end of the 20th century. How do we allow these things to continue to happen? Here it is, year after year, Darfur and the Congo and beyond. It's a war on women. It's not rape as a weapon of war. It's rape as a strategy of war. It's meant to humiliate and have entire communities to submit through their women in order to extract the resources that lie beneath the communities, or to use the communities as slaves to extract those resources. And of course, in the violence, the sexual violence, there results in tremendous transmission of the virus, and more women are turning up HIV positive at the Pansy Hospital. And that leads me to the 6th Millennium Development Goal, which is to turn back the communicable diseases of AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria. And all I can say to you is that about AIDS, as strongly as we struggle internationally, the virus continues to outwit us, to manipulate its way into country after country. It outstrips our capacity to respond. Last year, 1 million more people were put into treatment, which is a wonderful achievement. But there were 2.5 million new infections. We're still losing this battle. And no matter how many people we put in treatment, we're 5 or 6 million short of the objective, which means we may never get to them in time to save their lives. And we even now have the drugs that are available free or at costs so low that most countries can absorb the costs. And that is, I'd like to say this because I think everyone should know, that is thanks to the Clinton Foundation. That's not thanks to the brand name pharmaceutical companies, who were far more interested in their balance sheets than they were in the survival of humankind. The profits were vastly more important than lowering of prices sufficient to be able to disperse those drugs widely, universally throughout Africa. And it took Clinton going to India, going to Delhi, and negotiating with the generic drug companies to get the drugs, the antiretroviral drugs, at prices which could be afforded. Even now, the brand name pharmaceuticals cannot provide first-line treatment for less than roughly $500 to $800 per person per year. Clinton negotiated a price of $139 per person per year, and the price continues to come down, and those generic drugs are in every way bioequivalent to the brand name drugs. And we're starting to do work on pediatric drugs, and finally we're beginning to find the medical interventions required, the drug interventions required to prevent the transmission of the virus from the HIV-positive pregnant woman to the child during the birthing process. But still, there are only 1/3 of the HIV-positive pregnant women in Africa who have access to drugs. So you've got hundreds of thousands of children born HIV-positive every year. 50% of them die before the age of 2. 80% of them die before the age of 5. No reason in the world. Do you hear of HIV-positive children being born in Houston or Dallas or any major city in Texas? In the Western world, we put the mother, the HIV-positive mother, on full antiretroviral therapy through the bulk of her pregnancy, and the child emerges HIV negative. In Africa, not only do a handful of women, relatively speaking, have access to the drugs, but we use one drug. We use a drug called nevirapine, for the most part. And you give one tablet to the mother while she's giving birth, and the liquid equivalent to the infant within 72 hours of being born, and you can reduce the transmission by 40 or 50%. But why the double standard? Why a limited drug intervention in Africa and a full drug intervention in Western Europe and North America? Are African children worth so much less than Western children? And there's a tremendous effort being made on prevention in every area. We've had dreadful setbacks on vaccines, very serious setbacks on microbicides. Trials have failed. That's a tragedy, but that's a reality, and it is unlikely that we'll have a vaccine before another 10 or 15 years. Microbicides are gels or foams or creams which are vaginally applied to prevent transmission of the virus. You know what the most successful preventive technology is in the last year or two? It's male circumcision. Trials in Uganda, Kenya, and South Africa have demonstrated that circumcised men have a reduction in transmission from an HIV-positive woman of something like 50 to 60%. That's very dramatic. So from Rwanda to Swaziland, gradually they're beginning to do male circumcision under surgically safe environments. And it will ultimately bring the numbers of infections down. I remember when I was on the copper belt of of Zambia, and I was meeting with the mining companies to talk about their miners and protection for their miners. And suddenly the chairman of the District Health Council said, "Mr. Lewis, let's stop you for a moment and tell you, sir, that in our community, the prevalence rates are very low, and that's because we're circumcised. And in the surrounding communities, they're very high because they're uncircumcised." And there was a kind of titter of gentle laughter and subdued applause. And I thought it was a perfectly appropriate time for me to tell them that I was circumcised. So I did. And there followed what I can only describe as an orgy of male bonding, the like of which I've never seen. I've never been hugged so extravagantly in my adult life. But everybody in Africa understands what they're dealing with. At the grassroots in Africa, it's a tremendously sophisticated, intelligent society, particularly amongst the women. It's filled with decency and generosity of spirit. If only they could have the resources and the technical assistance which has been promised. But on every front there are efforts made. But I have to tell you, the toll continues. And the toll is most dramatic in its consequences in the number of orphans. It's a monumental number. It's 14 million orphans in sub-Saharan Africa. You want to have projects within beyond traditional borders and Rice 360 that can be directed at some way of sustaining orphan households. That would be the most magnificent contribution, because no one knows what to do about the orphans. No one. No country knows what to do. And these kids are so bewildered. They're so frantic. I can't tell you how many homes I have entered in the last several years where it's always the same scene. Usually the woman, the mother, lying under fetid cloth on a earthen floor, emaciated in the last throes of AIDS-related illness. And her little kids are rushing through the village to find an aspirin for relieving the pain of an opportunistic infection, or find a cloth to wipe the brow of the mother, or sometimes cleaning up an incontinent mother. It's so humiliating for mother and child. And then they stand in the hut and they watch their mothers die. And it's completely inexplicable for them. They have no comprehension what has happened. This anchor of life yanked away. It's so bewildering. And they're like children everywhere. They're so resilient. They have so much curiosity and awe and wonder and play. But if you take them aside and you talk to them about their loss, the feelings are so intense and so bewildered. And the communities try to absorb these kids, but the communities are too poor. The extended family tries to absorb them. The extended family is decimated. And then out come the grandmothers, the unsung heroes of the continent. They bury their own adult children, and at the age of 50, 60, 70, and 80, they begin to parent again. They begin to look after their orphan grandchildren, 5, 10, 15 orphan grandchildren. These grandmothers are a colossus. They are magnificent. They are so courageous, so resilient, so nurturing. In many countries, 40 to 60% of the orphan kids are being looked after by their grandmothers. You know, it's like a redefinition of the human family. There's been nothing like this historically, not even the Black Death of the 14th century. It is as though we were redesigning the human dynamic. All these grandmothers, and they die too. And they don't know what will happen to their orphan grandchildren, and they're often frantic. But around the virus, there still remains a tremendous need to respond with an urgency and an emergency which is not yet evident. We have been mired in a kind of delinquent passivity internationally, which is absolutely unforgivable. Because there's no reason for people to die in such numbers. I don't know what it is about Africa. I remember those 100 days between April 6, 1994 and early July 1994, when 800,000 people were slaughtered in the Rwandan genocide in the full light of the world, and the world raised not a finger. And everybody said never again. And along comes Darfur. And everybody says never again. And along comes the Congo. And everyone says never again. And along comes HIV. What is it? Why are millions of lovely, wonderful people expendable? I can't help but feel, if I may be intensely personal, that there's a strong element of subterranean racism at work here. I don't know how else to explain the willingness of the world to watch this happen with a kind of distance, a kind of observational passivity. And the seventh Millennium Development Goal is to achieve environmental sustainability, and I'm not going to dwell on that except to point out that if Al Gore were receiving his Nobel Prize today, he would have made a much more radical speech than he made in the fall of last year because events have moved so dramatically. I actually teach climate change at a university in Canada. I love it. It masquerades under the title of global health, and I'm completely fraudulent and bogus. I have no validity or legitimacy as a teacher, I assure you. I don't even have a degree. I have lots of honorary degrees. However, I went to 4 post-secondary institutions over an endless number of years and managed never but ever to acquire a degree. I therefore spent my entire adult life shamelessly lusting after honorary degrees to get through the back door, what was so lamentably denied me through the front. So I teach this stuff, and the more I read, read a book like Tim Flanagan's The Weathermakers, or read George Monbiot's book on heat, or read the astonishing study that was done in the United Kingdom in order to see what the implications were for the UK of global warming. And there is no question that we're inviting the apocalypse between 2030 and 2050 if we do not somehow reduce the discharge of carbon dramatically. And that's why that particular Millennium Development Goal is of such urgency. And finally, the last Millennium Development Goal, and you can all heave a sigh of relief as I inch my way to a finale, was to build a partnership between the developed world on the one hand and the developing world on the other, such that the developed world wouldn't betray its promises the moment they were made. And that's the conundrum. The G8 countries get together in these grand jamborees like the Global Summit in 2005, and they make all kinds of promises to Africa, and then they do not deliver on their promises, and it is a matter of consternation and amazement, even in the citadels of the World Bank and the IMF and the former Secretary General Kofi Annan and numbers of wonderful NGOs who follow this stuff, how the G8 can be so delinquent having made these commitments. Why do they make the commitments if they have no intention of delivering them? That's why Bono is apoplectic. That's why Geldof is out of control, although I judge he's almost always out of control. I can't get over the way in which the promises to Africa are so easily discarded. I mentioned Bono and Geldof. There's Angelina Jolie and Brad Pitt, and Oprah Winfrey and Alicia Keys, and Madonna and Richard Gere. All of these celebrities who are now appealing for international sanity around these issues. Why? We have celebrity leadership in the absence of political leadership. That's what's happened internationally. That doesn't mean that I diminish the contribution of the Presidential Fund here in the United States towards the fight against AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria, nor the Global Fund, nor the Gates Foundation, nor the Clinton Foundation, but there is a lack of commitment and a lack of energy around the human toll, which is frankly inexplicable. I don't begrudge the celebrity involvement. If I can enhance my legitimacy with everyone here, I occasionally talk to Bono. Surely that elevates me in your eyes. I once took Oprah Winfrey to Zambia. Can you believe that? Traveling with Oprah. I testified in Congress with Alicia Keys. I opened my television set the other morning and I saw that George Clooney was saving the world. Well, I didn't know that. I found it quite charming, actually, and I was immensely relieved. When I was in Malawi recently, I was taken to a hotel room by the manager of the hotel who said to me, "Mr. Lewis, we feel we have to tell you that we have given you the room that Madonna just vacated. Had a moment of erotic levitation. I thought to myself, this is a most extraordinary time of my life. But in truth, these celebrities do a great deal, but they cannot ultimately summon the response which is required. That response has to come from governments, as you can see happening now in this country. When things fall apart, governments have to intervene. The President of the United States may have a belief in the free market and in the private sector above all, but when the private sector fails, when greed prevails, when things fall apart because the balance sheets are more important than human betterment, then the government has to step in. And for Africa, if the G8 delivered on its promises, then as Jeffrey Sachs, the economist, has said, as Joseph Stiglitz, the economist, has said, as so many of the thoughtful commentators in the world have said, it would make all the difference in the world. You have a tremendous opportunity here in terms of beyond traditional borders and Rice 360 to make a contribution. I can't tell you how valued it is. I've seen in the area of Rice what it can mean when we had these women being interviewed from Zimbabwe to take the affidavits of the terrible sexual violence. We were worried about possible emotional and physical consequences and the medical condition they were in. And I phoned Mark Klein of the Baylor Pediatric Initiative, and I asked Mark for some help in the city where the interviews were being conducted. I want to tell you, the Baylor pediatric doctors were unbelievable. They saw those women, they reassured those women, they intervened when the women needed help in a way which was magical. I haven't seen that kind of thing before. And I'm forever beholden, but it reminds me in the moment of being beholden that the contributions that can be made are endless. And you're working at community level, and that's where the struggle will be won. The big money goes to drugs, to laboratories, to infrastructures, and to the training of health professionals. And all of that is needed in profusion. But the life and death struggle is at community level. And that's where your work ultimately is focused. And you should be proud of that and pleased with that and plunge into that. I've kicked around in politics. I've kicked around in diplomacy. I've kicked around in multilateralism. I'm not a sweet innocent. I thought I understood the way the world works. I don't understand the way the world works. I don't understand the levels of injustice and indifference and isolation. And I've always believed that we all have it within us, individually and collectively, through magnificent NGOs like CARE and Save the Children and World Vision and Doctors Without Borders and Oxfam and AMREF, or through tremendous initiatives like Beyond Traditional Borders and Rice 360. We have it within us to make a profound difference in the lives people lead. It's the quest for social justice and equality. And there is, in my humble opinion, no quest more noble than that. Thank you for having me. Thank you immensely. As you can see, I'm in a very Castro-like phase these days. You're lucky I stopped before midnight. Josh.
Yes.
Should I perhaps take a couple of questions if there are questions?
Yes, yeah, but first of all, we just wanted to thank you for speaking, Mr. Lewis, as well as Rebecca Richards-Cordum, Yvette Mirabal, Janet Wheeler, Lauren Vestwig from Rice 360 and the Beyond Traditional Borders program, as well as Kirsten Matthews from the Baker Institute, and their support for sponsoring Mr. Lewis's speech here, so thank you. And before we begin, just I'd like to apologize. We can't take all of your questions tonight, but we'll try to get as many as possible in here. So to start off, How can non-governmental institutions work together to move beyond pilot projects in small communities towards large regional impact plans?
It's very, very difficult, and some of the best endowed non-governmental organizations have tried to do that, and it hasn't been rolled out. You cannot roll it out without the participation of government. The most ambitious plan of its kind is probably the Millennium Development Villages of Jeffrey Sachs. And Jeffrey has them all over Africa. He has them at local level, at district level. He's trying to show that if you address operationally all of you address water, nutrition, education, health, sanitation, culture, roads, communication, if you address everything operationally and then follow it carefully so that you document everything you've done, and if you can do that in concert with the government, you may be able to roll it out at some point, but it's very difficult. If you speak to the NGOs like the ones I named, they all have numbers of models and pilot projects, and they're struggling to roll them out. But you've got to have the support internationally for that kind of effort, and you have to have the support of the local governments. Otherwise, it makes no sense. You're not there to be neo-colonialists. You're there to work within the plans of the government itself. So that's one of the toughest questions, and I don't think there's an easy answer for it. There's a woman named Dr. Julia Kim, who did a fascinating study in KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa just in the last year or two, in which she showed that women who were in receipt of microcredit, if they were brought together and asked to discuss questions of AIDS and questions of violence in their lives, incredibly enough, after just 18 months, the levels of domestic violence declined, and the men in the community had a much greater admiration and regard for the women. And Julia Kim, I sat with her at the International AIDS Conference in Mexico City last month. She was a panelist. I was chairing the panel. She was superb. And I was asking her this question, Julia, how do you roll it out? This is fantastic. How in a society where women are so beleaguered and the virus is so intense and the women are so disproportionately infected, as is true throughout Africa, how do we spread what you found? And she couldn't even find the money to take it the next step. It's a very difficult business.
If we were able to secure the necessary funds to deal with the HIV/AIDS crisis, how can we increase the likelihood the money goes to the right places and not into the pockets of corrupt governments?
Well, I want to come at that in two ways. One is, I don't want to be overly self-righteous about corrupt governments. In my country, the last federal election was fought almost entirely around an issue of corruption, and the government lost because of corruption. And you will forgive my saying so, but take a close look at Iraq, and you'll get a new meaning of corruption from this government, from the government of the United States. Look at some of the behavior of multinational corporations. There is no area in the world where corruption is somehow confined. Can I recommend a book? Can I recommend that people might, in this audience, might like to read a remarkable book called The Shock Doctrine, The Rise of Disaster Capitalism. It's been on the New York Times bestseller list, so it must be a good book. And it was reviewed very respectfully by Joe Stiglitz, who's a Nobel Prize economist, so it must be a good book. I know the writer extremely well, and it's a young woman in her 30s, astonishingly gifted, and it tends to demonstrate the way in which corruption has suffused the responses to crises, whether it's a tsunami or a Katrina or an Iraq war or a war in Sri Lanka or wherever. And crises have tended to enrich those who respond. Very, very fascinatedly argued, and I'm inclined to agree with that. Africa has some significantly corrupt governments. Zimbabwe, obviously, the Congo, Nigeria struggling, Kenya struggling, but sub-Saharan Africa also has 54 countries. And a great majority of them are now democratically elected and democratically re-elected. Think of Ghana, think of Senegal, think of Mali, think of Mauritania, think of Tanzania, think of Botswana. The country after country is merging into a democratic society. And think as well, if I may, that one of the reasons these African governments have inherited corruption is because the corruption was induced by the Western world or the Eastern world that sustained them, largely through the Cold War period. Who do you think kept Mobutu going in Zaire as he drained his country of resources and killed his people? I mean, the behavior of the East and the West during the Cold War in particular was really odious, and the levels of corruption which were induced and have continued and are now being diminished is really a legacy. I mean, slavery, colonialism, Cold War, structural adjustment programs, intense poverty and disease. And now the International Panel on Climate Change says that the strongest consequences of climate change will be felt in southern Africa. So you'll have more drought, more famine, struggles over water in the most vulnerable societies in the world. And this pattern, which is almost conspiratorial in its collective impact, has been visited on Africa with very little response and with a lot of malice. I don't have a lot of time for it. I spent too much time in the 80s when I was at the UN watching the structural adjustment programs, fighting with the World Bank over the way they were sustaining corrupt dictatorships, and the World Bank laughed it off and then apologized. It's incredible what we've done. And I think that gradually countries like Kenya and Nigeria will do away with corruption. Takes time. Took the United Kingdom, the mother of parliaments, 1,832 years before they had their first democratic election. It wasn't really democratic, it was a bunch of rotten boroughs. And if it took the British 1,832 years, would you please give Africa a little time? Many of these countries have been independent from between 20 to 50 years, and they've been manipulated extraordinarily, primarily by the Western world. And they're doing collectively not badly, despite the evidence of some that scar the reality for all the others.
Yes, that's an excellent point. What do you think about large foundations like the Gates Foundation and other global foundations choosing and directing aid in Africa to specific projects? And are they choosing, in your opinion, the best projects and solutions?
I think that the Gates Foundation makes a tremendous contribution, and so do the other major foundations. I will be honest, it worries me a little that one huge foundation is largely setting the agenda for global health. I mean, thank God Bill Gates is on our side. What if he was a crusty Philistine and on some other side? It would be very unnerving. He tends to make the right decisions, although more and more he's focused on an effort to deal with prevention, to find a vaccine, to find a microbicide. He's not as much focused anymore on the sort of grassroots project stuff. That's left to the big NGOs and to smaller foundations. I have a foundation in Canada, and we distribute now, Canadian people have been very incredibly generous, and we distribute now something in the vicinity of $10 to $12 million a year, all to small projects. We put it all into the bank accounts of local communities. We don't put it through governments, we don't put it through NGOs. It goes right into the bank accounts of the grassroots communities. We now fund about 150 projects in 15 countries, and you can see when you work with the grassroots that you can transform those communities. Tremendous hope in society, but there aren't enough foundations of a smaller kind. There's a wonderful foundation called Firelight in California, the American Jewish World Service in New York. There are 3 or 4 others that give out small grants of between $10,000 and $50,000 per project, which make all the difference in the world. You cannot imagine the difference it makes. But Gates gives big money $200 million to India for so-and-so, which is terribly important, but the communities is where the change will come, and the communities don't have the money.
And what do you think is the most successful effort you've seen by a private citizen to address global health and poverty?
By a private citizen? Well, I've seen, you mean global health, and really global?
Yes.
Because the private citizens I've seen, whose names I would love to invoke, are a number of the African women with whom I've worked. But in global terms, I think I would be inclined to choose two people, well, three people in global terms, rather than forcing me into one, which I know you will permit me, because there's not a thing you can do about it. Number one, I would say that Clinton has made an astonishing contribution. I mean, I have nothing but regard for what the Clinton Foundation does and what he himself does in these international areas. He has kept untold people alive by virtue of when I feel I'm in trouble as I'm traveling and need something, I was in Tanzania. I was in the island of Zanzibar, which is a part of Tanzania. I visited the local hospital. They had 168 people on the list who needed treatment desperately. They were dying in front of you. They had been brought to the hospital in wheelbarrows, carried on the backs of their families. They were in terrible shape. I said to the doctor, "Why aren't you treating them?" He said, "I can't treat them until we've taken a CD4 count," which is a count of white blood cells to see what their reading is and whether they're low enough to require treatment. I said, "You don't need a CD4 machine. The World Health Organization says that if they present themselves at stage 3 or stage 4 of AIDS, they're obviously in need of treatment. You can treat. You don't need a CD. We will not do it without a CD4 machine." I went to the president of Zanzibar. He said, "Oh, this is terrible. I'll speak to my wealthy friends." I wouldn't go to the UN because I knew it would take 6 months, and I am a defender and an apologist for the UN, but I also know its limitations. So I went to the Clinton Foundation, and literally overnight, they were taking samples in Zanzibar, flying them into Dar es Salaam, getting the results back immediately, and then getting a CD4 machine. And when the Panzi Hospital in the Congo, in Bukavu, needed a CD4 machine, I wrote to the Clinton Foundation and said, "You've got to get them out of this predicament." And whether it's a particular item of that kind, or the reduction in prices in drugs, or getting pediatric formulations, which we didn't have before, so I really honor him for that. The second person I honor is a kind of twin. It's partners in health. It's Paul Farmer and Jim Kim. It's just this most astonishing amalgam of brilliance and intelligence. They have Joya Mukherjee and wonderful doctors and nurses associated. But I've watched Paul Farmer work in rural Rwanda and in Malawi and in Lesotho, and I've got to tell you, the work that Jim and Paul do together, but Paul in the field, Jim at Harvard, is something to witness. And Partners in Health is a magnificent organization. And the final person is the person I would lay down my life for in this world, and her name is Graca Machel. Graca Machel is the former First Lady of Mozambique, the former Minister of Education of Mozambique. She's married to Nelson Mandela. She's known everywhere as Mama Africa. She's the most extraordinarily charismatic and forceful and lovely and intelligent presence. And Graca has been chair of the Global Vaccine Initiative, and she has mobilized women across the continent and has a tremendous influence on the policies of the United Kingdom and of Gordon Brown. And she's just a phenomenal figure. And those would be my sort of choices, rather than the celebrities whom you would have wished me to embrace. Was that the last question you were going to ask?
There was one more question.
Okay. I wanted to come back to Graca, but go ahead.
Well, maybe after we're finished with this last one. What advances in technology do you think will have the greatest impact on HIV transmission or AIDS in Africa?
Vaccine. We've got to have a vaccine. We cannot give up on searching for a vaccine. I think if we discover a microbicide, which we'll probably do before we get to a vaccine, that will give women some degree of sexual autonomy, so that the sexual entitlement, which is so widely spread amongst men in Africa, will be to some extent countered by microbicide. The problem is that the hope for a microbicide is the effort to develop what they're calling an intravaginal ring, which will discharge medication over 30 to 60 days, so that the woman does not always have to anticipate when the next sexual exchange will come. And if that happens, a microbicide may be quite effective for a significant number of women, although it will take a lot of time to encourage rural women in particular to be comfortable with using a microbicide. But the answer has to lie in a vaccine. There are those who believe, the present president of the International AIDS Society, Dr. Julio Montaner, believes that treatment is equivalent to prevention. And if you get all of those who are infected or in high-risk groups for infection, men having sex with men, injecting drug users, sex workers, if you get more and more of them on antiretroviral treatment, then antiretroviral treatment, the drugs lower your viral load to undetectable levels. So the theory is that if you're on treatment and the viral load is undetectable and you engage in unprotected sex, you're unlikely to transmit the virus. And so people like Julio Montaner make the argument that it is a question of getting everybody on treatment and gradually you will reduce, level out, and then eliminate transmission. There is another fascinating theory in the preventive world, which has been best articulated by Helen Epstein in her recent book, I think The Fate of Africa. Helen Epstein argues that the virus is transmitted through what is called concurrent partnerships, and that organizations like UNAIDS and the World Health Organization never paid enough attention to the phenomenon of what happens in Africa. You have men with 3 or 4 partners to whom they return frequently, and perhaps the woman has a couple of partners, and it's a very tightly knit network of partners, very closely knit. And when one of that little group gets infected, everybody gets infected very quickly because there's this constant exchange of sexual relationship. And that, says Helen Epstein, is what explains what happened in Uganda. It wasn't simply that President Museveni of Uganda sounded the alarm and went on a campaign to say zero grazing. That was his mantra, zero grazing. That means men shouldn't graze beyond the partner they had. It was because at community level, the women understood these tightly linked concurrent partnerships and broke them, went to the people involved in them and said, stop. And Helen Epstein argues that at community level, that's one of the best ways to break the pattern of the virus. Can I end with a story about Graca? I warned you. Then I will sit down and take my place as people would wish me urgently and desperately to do, but you don't have to invite me back. I was traveling with Graca in Uganda. We were in the district of Rakai, which is the epicenter, ground zero for the virus in Uganda. The first case, I guess, was in 1982 in Rakai. And it's like so many other parts of Africa, it's a weird sensation because there are no men. The men have died, the women are few in number, and there are children everywhere. And you're losing that generation between 15 and 49, just not there. So the villagers said to us, we want to take you to see a child-headed household. Because in Africa, when there's no one left in the extended family, and there simply is no grandmother, there's no one to look after the kids, the oldest sibling in the family looks after the younger siblings. So we went to a child-headed household, as we were asked, of course. They were 5 kids. There were 3 little girls, 14, 12, and 10, and 2 little boys, 11 and 8. And we went into the hut, and I remember Graca sat down with her back to the wall of the hut with her right arm around the 3 little girls, and I sat down with my back to the wall of the hut with my arm around the 2 little boys. And Graca shooed everyone out of the hut, all the hangers-on, all the journalists, all the UN types. We were left with 1 community worker and 1 translator. I had no idea what was coming, none. And Graca turned to the 2 older girls and said, very gently, "Have you started to menstruate yet?" And the 2 little girls, in those shy, whispered voices of African children, said, "Yes." And Graca said, "Do you know what it means? Do you talk to the villagers about it? Do you talk to your teachers about it? Do you talk to the other kids about it?" And as I sat there listening, I realized that I was witness to the first act of mothering those little girls had ever received on one of the most transformational experiences in a young girl's life. And I thought to myself, that's what's happened. You've lost a generation. The knowledge and values and love and experience which we hand down normally from parents to children, it's gone. Kids are fending for themselves. I remember I tried to restore a sense of place by saying to the older girl, "Who puts you to bed at night?" And she said, "Well, I put us to bed at night." And I said, "Yeah, but it's dark and it's scary. Do no neighbors come in?" And she looked at me almost belligerently and said, "I'm the mother. I put us to bed at night." And I remember leaving with Graca and chatting with her amiably about what we'd seen, and thinking together that the price that is being paid in truly lovely countries, in fundamentally decent societies, is a terrible scar on human behavior, and it need not be. And I hope in Beyond Traditional Borders and Rice 360, you're able to institute as much solidarity and compassion and engagement as the human family deserves. Thank you, Josh.